Well, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for taking your time today to attend this webinar event where we can learn about the recent major political shift in Japan from Kishida to Ishiba cabinet in the wake of LDP leadership election last month. I would like to begin this event by acknowledging that it is organized on UBC Vancouver campus, situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. As an online event having participants worldwide, it is important to reflect upon and acknowledge each land that you're joining from, where we have the privilege of learning and working on as a member of this vibrant academic community. My name is Miyoko Mimura, and I'm a student assistant at the UBC Center for Japanese Research. It is with great pleasure to welcome you all to this event. I will now like to invite Dr. Yves Tebogian, a professor of political science from University of British Columbia, who is also a director of the Center for Japanese Research and Konwakai Chair in Japanese Research.
Thank you, Miyoko-san, and thank you also, Mei-san, who have both worked very hard on organizing this. Welcome, everyone, to this exciting event. In the name of both the Monk School and particularly Phillip Lipscy, its director, the director of the Center for Global Japan, and UBC Center for Japanese Research. It's a true joy and honor to welcome all of you to this discussion. This is, when you think of it, taking up the job of Prime Minister of Japan at this moment is a very, very stressful job. Not only the Prime Minister has to fight within his party, has to fight an election domestically, but has to attend all the global summits that happen in this season, from the ASEAN, where he just went, to the G20 and the APEC summit next month and handled the US election and so on. So this is a period of extremely fast change at a time when Japan has had significant adjustment in its position in the global order. We're going to understand today what's happening politically, what's happening policy-wise, and what's happening in terms of Japan's direction in the global order. I'm not going to say more. We just have a wonderful panel here. Over to you, Miyoko-san.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Tebogian. So in this event, we're focusing on the following exciting questions. What are the takeaways from Kishida's premiership over 3 years? What were achievements and shortcomings, including structural issues that remain essentials beyond the policy cycle? Why did Kishida fall and why Ishiba win? Any deeper lessons or meanings from this power transition? What can we say about the Ishiba cabinet, political support, and the policy proposals so far? And lastly, what can be expected from the October 27th election? For today's event, we're joined by many brilliant speakers from Canada, America, and Japan. I would like to welcome Dr. Kenneth McElwain, a professor of comparative politics at the University of Tokyo, and in 2024 to 2025, he is a visiting professor of political science at Columbia University. Dr. Rieko Kage, a professor of political science at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Tokyo. Dr. Harutaka Takenaka, a professor of political science at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, in Tokyo. Dr. Kei Shimizu, a research professor in the Graduate School of International and Public Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. And Dr. Phillip Lipscy, a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and the director of the Center for the Study of Global Japan. Now, let's start our event, and please use the Q&A function to ask any questions for the later Q&A session time. So please welcome our first speaker, Dr. Kenneth McElwain.
Thank you very much. Please let me know if the slide is showing up in an odd way on your screen.
It works. It's so good.
I have both the pleasure and the daunting task of trying to predict what's going to happen in an election, which is something that no political scientist should really try to do. But I think this election stands out for a number of reasons. One, of course, is the varying scandals that the LDP has been embroiled in over the last few years. Also, it's the first national election in 2 years. It's the longest time span that there's been since national elections for the last decade or so. And so I think in some ways there's a lot of excitement, coupled with questions about how the election will unfold going forward. And I want to speak more broadly about the prospects of government turnover, effectively the LDP Komeito coalition losing. And I think existing research points that government turnover occurs when two conditions align. The first is when there's significant dissatisfaction with the status quo government. And in that sense, I think the direction for the LDP is not necessarily positive. For one, Prime Minister Ishiba is polling worse than former Prime Minister Kishida was at the same period when he took office in October 2021. I'm showing two polls that were conducted fairly recently by reputable media companies. The Jijitsushin did their poll on October 11th to 14th. They show Ishiba's approval rating at 28% compared to 40% for Kishida in 2021. NHK has a poll around the same time where they have Ishiba doing a little bit better, but still trailing Kishida at the same time at 44% to 49%. And it's not simply the prime minister not doing well. The LDP is also polling worse than in 2021. In Gigi, their affinity rating, when you ask voters which party do you prefer the most, LDP is at 19% compared to 20% in 2021. NHK showed 35 to 38%. So these things, these data points suggest that the tides are not necessarily in the LDP's favor. But a second condition needs to manifest for government turnover to happen, which is there needs to be a clear alternative to the status quo government. And I think this is where there are two red marks, and that's what I would like to speak primarily about today. The first demerit is that the opposition party has failed to do what it has often failed to do over the last decade and a half, which is to coordinate candidates as a unified opposition to the LDP. The second, which is to some extent a point that perhaps is less mentioned in the media or in reports, is that the exact electoral context this year may privilege parties that can mobilize an organized vote over those that depend on independence or floating votes. So let me expand on these points. Even though the LDP's popularity has waned over the last few years, whether or not they lose depends on whether those who are opposed to the LDP coalesce behind a unified opposition candidate. And in this context, it looks like the LDP may benefit from opposition disarray. The lower house election is contested in two tiers. One is 289 single-member districts, coupled with a proportional representation tier that elects fewer seats. And I'm going to talk primarily about the single-member districts. In this context, the LDP has nominated 266 candidates in 289 districts. The main opposition, the Constitutional Democratic Party, is 207. The more regional party based in Kansai, Ishin, has 163 candidates, while the Communists, a fairly small party overall, but a very old party, of course, has 213 candidates. The problem is that the CDP, Ishin, and JCP are to varying degrees fighting over similar pools of voters, or at least trying to coalesce those who are opposed to the LDP. In 2021, there were 145 districts out of 289. So roughly half of the districts where the opposition parties agreed to only nominate one candidate from amongst their rank. So in effect, to propose a unified candidate. In this context, by contrast, there are only 44 districts where that one-to-one battle is going to take place. The Constitutional Democratic Party and Ishin are competing in the same district in 115 cases, and the CDP with the Communists in 142 districts. What this means is that even though there may be many voters who are angry with the LDP or would prefer an alternative, it's not clear which alternative they will vote for, meaning the vote may fragment and the LDP may win by default, even if they do not win a majority in those districts. the second contextual point is that this election is going to be chaotic due to massive redistricting that took place in a 2022 electoral reform. And in fact, electoral redistricting has been increasing in both scope and pace over the last decade. In 2014, 42 districts, or I should add that redistricting is a case where either prefectures are given additional seats, and therefore new districts need to be redrawn, and by association, district boundaries may be redrawn around them. In effect, if you're creating one new district, that means that boundaries have to be changed in adjoining districts as well. The 2014 reform produced 42 districts where some boundary changes occurred, so about 13% of the total. In 2017, there were 97 districts, so about a third of all districts. And in the 22 reform, which is kicking in for this upcoming election, 140 districts, or 48%, roughly half of the districts have been affected. And let me talk a little bit about my own context. I live in Meguro Ward in Tokyo. And in 2014 election, the incumbent who was running in that district was Wakamiya-san from the LDP. But due to the redistricting that happened before the 2017 contest, when I went to vote, or actually I can't vote, I'm from Ireland. When my wife went to vote, the incumbent was Nagatsuma from the CDP. In the upcoming 2024 contest, the incumbent is going to be Jin Matsubara, who was formerly with the CDP, but is actually running as an independent at that time. So I have not moved, but the district in which I live has changed multiple times across electoral districts. This poses problems in a larger sense for democratic accountability. You cannot hold your incumbent accountable because the incumbent changes from the last election to the current one. But in a more practical sense, it increases information costs for voters. You don't know who's running until fairly close to the contest, and you have to learn anew who the incumbent is and who the rivals are. And in preliminary analysis that I've done, districts that are affected by some form of redistricting tends to have lower turnout by between 3 to 7%. And the percentage differs a little bit by year and whether or not you live in urban or rural districts. But this comes to my main argument, which is the key question for this election is going to be voter turnout. The chart at the top is taken from the Yomiuri, and it shows voter turnout in lower house elections since 1946. In the last decade, voter turnout has plummeted, and in the last 2021 contest, it was 55.9%. The reason lower turnout matters is for opposition parties to win, they need to corral independent voters. Those who may not necessarily vote all the time, but whose turnout may swing the election in favor of the opposition. But according to an NHK poll a few weeks ago, what we see is that the governing coalition, the LVP plus Komeito's party affinity, proportion of voters who say they support them is 39%. The major opposition parties, by contrast, is only at 17%. Independents are 34% of the electorate. And so for government turnover to occur, the opposition needs to successfully mobilize and persuade these independents to come to their side. But it's not clear that's going to happen because of the opposition disunity, as well as the massive electoral redistricting that has taken place. And when turnout is low, it tends to benefit parties that have established organized vote bases, namely the LDP, Komeito, and to some extent the communists. But these trends indicate that the LDP, while they may lose seats on their own, may be reasonably successful in maintaining their majority with the upcoming election. Let me end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. McElwain. So I will now like to invite Dr. Rieko Kage.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly share my slides. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Thank you. I'm Rieko Kage, I teach at the University of Tokyo. I'd like to thank Eve and Miyoko May, the team at UBC, for their really hard work in organizing this event. Also Phillip and his team as co-hosts of this event at the University of Toronto. In my presentation, I'm going to be focusing mainly on gender issues. And in terms of assessing Kishida's record over the last few years, this is one area in which he has not had a tremendous amount of success. As you can see, in the last 10, really 20 years, the percentage of female representatives, this is in the lower house, really has not risen very markedly, despite the increase in female candidates over this period. And again, this puts Japan at 163rd in the world in terms of the percentage of female MPs. In all fairness, the upper house has done somewhat better, and the percentage of House of Councilors members now stands at 27.1%, which is the highest percentage ever. This is in the upper house. But the low percentage of women in the lower house does create problems for women who aspire to higher office, as the lower house is more of a breeding area for politicians hoping to reach the prime ministerial positions and other cabinet positions. In the last LDP presidential elections last month, 2 out of the 9 candidates were women, and we know that one of them, Sanae Takaichi, did reach the final round, narrowly losing to Ishiba. And so in my presentation, I will be speaking mainly about public opinion towards female legislators and political leaders. To what extent do Japanese voters support women entering politics or reaching leadership positions in the political world? And political scientists tend to think in terms of demand and supply side factors in explaining low rates of female parliamentarians. Demand side factors having more to do with the views of the public opinion. To what extent does it discriminate or are they biased against female candidates? Supply side factors having more to do with the decisions that lead female candidates to run for office in the first place. So this can be more about party gatekeepers and so forth. In terms of the demand side, there is a well-known study that has been conducted in the US, which shows that American voters tend to prefer, all other things being equal, female candidates over male candidates. And also that female candidates who are married and have children are preferred over those who are unmarried or do not have children. So on the one hand, American voters prefer female candidates, but they want these female candidates to have sort of traditional family lifestyles. So in our own survey, we went about trying to look for whether this may also be the case in Japan. And one challenge that scholars often face in trying to assess degrees of voter bias or discrimination against female candidates is this idea of social desirability bias. And so if you conduct a survey and ask respondents outright, do you prefer female or male candidates? Respondents are often going to be reluctant to openly disclose if there are indeed biased against female candidates, to openly express that in a survey setting, even in an anonymous setting. So scholars have developed all sorts of experimental tools to get around this bias. And in our study, we conduct what is known as a conjoint analysis. And this is sort of an example of what we show our respondents in our survey. And what the respondents see is a screen with 2 hypothetical politicians with different attributes. These attributes are randomized. And then we ask the respondents which 2 of these hypothetical candidates the respondent would like to vote for, or they would prefer to vote for if there were an election. And this sort of mitigates the social desirability bias that accompanies gender issues, because it's not just gender that is being posed to the respondent, but there's a number of other attributes that are being shown to the respondent. So it makes them more comfortable, if you will, in disclosing their biases. And these are the attributes that are randomized. So different respondents will see 2 candidates with very different backgrounds. Just as a baseline, we actually, in our survey, somewhat surprisingly, but also consistent with findings from the US, find that Japanese voters tend to prefer female over male candidates. And this is somewhat surprising given the very low percentage of female legislators. When we look at the other preferences of Japanese voters over the attributes of politicians, so what we display here are the extent to which Japanese voters prefer female or male legislators. And the zero, when the line crosses zero, that means that there's no real statistically significant difference. So starting at the bottom here, we see that there's no difference in the extent to which married, divorced, or single female candidates are preferred. So unlike in the US, there's no real preference for married female candidates. We also see that there's no real systematic preference for female candidates who have children. There is a slight preference for female candidates who have children over the age of 6 who are also being cared for by grandparents. But in terms of whether voters prefer female candidates to have children or not, there's really no systematic difference that we see. So in contrast to the US, Japanese voters tend actually not to care very much about the family background of female candidates. They can be married, single, divorced, have children, no children, whatever. We can also look at whether Japanese voters prefer women to focus on so-called more traditional female issues like welfare. And this is what we see in the area called priority area and policy, where we see that no, there's no systematic preference for female candidates to be focusing on welfare issues more than other issues like deregulation, policies towards small and medium enterprises or local. So overall, our results show surprisingly little voter bias against female candidates, which lead us to turn to more supply-side factors. This is the percentage of female candidates that each party is fielding, comparing 2021 and 2024. In this upcoming elections, actually, the parties overall are fielding 23.4% female candidates, which in fact is the highest ever. But what we see also is that there's quite a lot of variation across different parties in the percentage of female candidates that are being fielded. And in fact, the lowest percentage of female candidates are being fielded by the LDP and the Komeito, where the candidates have the highest probabilities of winning. So this really creates a bottleneck for female candidates to be elected. The opposition parties, like the CDP or the communists, and in fact, the socialists fielded 60% female candidates in 2021, do tend to field a lot more female candidates. But of course, these candidates have a much lower probability of winning. So leading to, there are other factors as well, but this does create a major bottleneck for female candidates trying to actually reach office. We actually also conducted a separate conjoint experiment asking respondents which politicians, LDP politicians, they would like to see elected as LDP president, or in other words, the prime minister. And what we see here is it looks like there is a small bias against female politicians here, but actually when you look very closely, the line, the 95% confidence interval crosses the zero line, so there's actually no statistically significant difference. And so in other words, voters do not systematically prefer women politicians from reaching the prime ministership more than male politicians. Looking here again, there's no real preference for married or single. Thank you. Politicians, female politicians from becoming president. For some reason, there is a slight preference for divorced female politicians for reasons we're not quite sure about. If anybody might have a good explanation, we'd be really interested. There's no preference for female politicians having children, no children. They are also not expected to be particularly more qualified than male politicians. So for instance, they are not expected to have more education than male politicians. Which speaks to the presidential elections that happened last month. Of course, that was conducted within the context of the LDP, but certainly within the context of the LDP presidential elections, we don't see a lot of voter bias against women reaching higher offices. So overall, we see limited voter bias against female candidates or political leaders, and which leads us to expect that in the event that a female politician is in fact elected prime minister, we can expect to see fairly limited voter backlash. Supply side factors play a greater role in shaping the low percentage of female legislators in Japan. Of course, in this year's election, as we saw earlier, we have the highest rate of female candidates, which leads us to be fairly optimistic in terms of the number of people who will be elected. They probably will be a higher percentage than last time, although again, by international standards, it will still be fairly low. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Kage. Okay, so I would now like to invite Dr. Harutaka Takenaka.
You're muted.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. I would like to thank you, Eve. Thanks, Eve, and Philip for organizing this event, and Miyoko-san for making many preparations. So I would like to give a little talk on the policies and a little bit on the prospect of general election as well. Okay. So let me start with Kishiba-san's Prime Minister Kishiba's policies, then to examine Prime Minister Ishiba's policies. Now, so what has Prime Minister Kishida achieved? He made a number of achievements in policies, starting from foreign and security policies. He succeeded in legislating economic security promotion law to increase Japanese economic security, encouraging various companies to produce production of critical materials such as semiconductors and batteries. And then he adopted 3 security documents. In short, with these documents, Japanese made a commitment to procure counter attack capabilities by having such cruise missiles as Tomahawk missiles, as shown in the picture. And also, he made a commitment to increase the defense budget by twice. I mean, he made a commitment to double the Japanese defense budget in 5 years. And he also announced a new plan for free and open Indo-Pacific strategy of Japan in March 23. And he strengthened the relationship between the Korea, which led to enhancing more cooperation among United States, Japan, and Korea. And also importantly, he strengthened relationship among United States, Japan, and the Philippines. And he succeeded in signing reciprocal access agreement with the United Kingdom and also with the Philippines. Okay, a number of achievements. And if you look at domestic policies, this really overlaps with economic security policies. He enhanced the production capacities of semiconductor. He succeeded in inviting the second factory of the TMC. The first factory has already been completed by the end of February this year. This is shown in the picture. And he announced a capital income double plan, as well as child future strategy. And also importantly, he supported a breakaway from Abenomics, and which is pursued by BOJ, Bank of Japan, and Governor Ueda. And he hasn't done many. Unfortunately, he has not made many achievements in the field of deregulation. Japan is one of the few. Well, in Vancouver, you cannot use Uber. I find it, but
No, we can now.
You can?
Yeah,
Okay.
since like 3 years ago, 4 years. Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, Japan is one of a few countries where you cannot use Uber. And Prime Minister made a rather half-hearted deregulation on rideshare. And so key takeaways. So he could accept the issue of deregulation of rideshare. He could Prime Minister Kishida showed he has a lot of clout. He could implement most of policies as he wished. But I have an interesting figure, which is the evaluation of Prime Minister Suga's achievement is higher than Prime Minister Kishida. Okay, Prime Minister Kishida, 57% of the respondents respond either they highly approve or rather approve Prime Minister Suga's achievement, while 48% answer that they highly approve or rather approve Prime Minister Kishida's achievement. And if you compare, like Prime Minister Suga was served as a Prime Minister just for a year, and Kishida, objectively, I think has accomplished much more policies than Suga, but the public evaluation for Kishida is lower than Prime Minister Suga. And how this happened? And my part of the reason is that he could not strategically present his policy achievement. Okay. And for example, he announced a new plan for Phillip one day before his visit to Kiev. So most of the newspapers just reported his visit to Kiev, and no one, I think, has really realized that he announced a new plan for Phillip, which included some new important policies, such as the virtual beginning of Japanese military assistance to foreign countries. Okay. And also, he launched the capital income double plan when people really focused on changes in security policies toward the end of the year 2022. So I would say he needed a director to present his policies more effectively and more clearly. Okay, that was takeaways. And transition from Kishida to Ishiba, why did this happen? It's pretty easy because there was no way for any prime minister to survive the kickback, the scandal as large, in such a scale as the kickback scandal. I think the kickback scandal was almost equal to recruit scandal or Tokyo Sagawa Cuban scandal, which really knocked out the LDP in 1990s. So then, why could Ishiba win in the September LDP presidential election? First of all, he's pretty popular. If you take the public opinion, he always ranked to number 1 or number 2 as the desired or preferred next prime minister. And Takaichi came first in the first round of the election, but Takaichi was too hawkish, making a commitment to visit Yasukuni Shrine and so forth. And Ishiba, although he is sometimes considered as hawk, but in domestic policy more liberal than Takaichi, so LDP politicians chose more moderate politicians as the prime minister. And there was also another issue that Takaichi tried to rig the LDP presidential election by breaking the rules, and some LDP politicians became very antagonistic towards Takaichi. So I think that was another reason why Takaichi could not obtain as many as votes as she wished. And larger picture is what's happening in the LDP is really the battle between the moderates and hawks and conservatives, and the moderates is trying to knock out the hawks and conservatives. I think they feel that the LDP went just too much to the right side in recent years. So if you look at the cabinet appointment very carefully, Ishiba cabinet and also LDP executive appointments, Ishiba carefully picked up the moderates. And Ishiba's policies, well, Ishiba's policies, I think you can just treat Ishiba cabinet as a Kishida cabinet 2.0. That is, most of his policies are the extensions of Prime Minister Kishida's policies. For example, I mean, most of you have realized that he made Prime Minister Ishiba made an announcement on the Asia's NATO or a revision of US-Japan status agreement and so forth. But I think he will not really pursue those policies. So he will strengthen US-Japan alliance, relationship with United Kingdom, as exemplified by the new plan for to jointly produce next jet fighters, and the relationship with other countries. And economic policies, again, this guy has not said many things about economic policies, so I would say he will really follow through a bunch of policies initiated by Prime Minister Kishida. And so, in particular in the field of economic policies, it will be bottom-up, and the METI, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry will play a larger role, especially now the issue of economic security has become so important for Japan. And METI is playing the leading role in formulating policy in that field. And general election, well, Kenneth has already made a detailed explanations on this, so I would say I don't have so many things to say, but I would say this election is probably the toughest for the LDP since the electoral reform we carried out in 1994, because the scandal, because of this, because the LDP is hit by this scandal, which is in terms of scale, the largest scandal ever happened since the end of 1990s. Since the beginning of 90s. Now, in other words, LDP never fought general election when they are hit by such a political scandal as this kickback scandal. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Takenaka. Okay, so now I would like to invite Dr. Shimizu.
Okay, can everyone see that? Am I good? Okay,
Yes.
thank you so much, Eve, and all your wonderful and capable staff over at UBC, and also to Phillip Center for hosting our event. It's really great to have this opportunity to talk to everyone and see old friends at the same time. So I was tasked to give a bit of an evaluation of Kishida's economic policies, and then the segue into Ishiba's new term. And I very much agree with what Harutaka has just presented to us. I think my overall summary of Kishida's economic policies would be that he had strong global economic ties, which were made over multiple meetings, both on the multilateral and bilateral levels, but on the domestic front, perhaps much weaker and underappreciated, in particular by everyday Japanese citizens, as well as smaller companies. And I'll talk a little bit about both in detail here. As those of us who are, travel between the US and Japan frequently, one of the big signs of global success for Japanese large corporations, especially exporters, was that during, especially these last 12 months, but throughout the little bit less than 3-year period of Kishida's prime ministership, Japanese exports were strongly supported by the weak yen, which of course resulted from the difference between Japan's very low interest rates and US fight of global inflation with much higher interest rates here in the United States. So that differential created an opportunity for a much weaker yen, which supported Japan's large corporations and especially their exporters. Of course, and this of course led to a record high for the Nikkei stock market earlier this year, although it was among a very volatile trading season, even during the summer months of high Nikkei prices. These benefits did not trickle down to smaller corporations that supported these larger companies. On the domestic front, wages were a little bit higher, supported by sort of government nudging, especially from Kishida himself. But the public demand, I think, for relief from both global inflation, which for Japan was particularly stark during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which ignited energy prices in Japan and really led to some inflation, and also the weak yen, which did not support the everyday Japanese person. I think Eve asked us about whatever happened to the new capitalism, which was supposed to redistribute wealth, especially among Japan's population, which this just simply never materialized, even though the higher wages came to be. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how those higher wages actually played out among the population. And for by and large, Kishida's economic policies were stopgap measures, including a flat tax cut of about 40,000 yen that was imparted onto every Japanese citizen taxpayer earlier this year, and also some limited subsidies and allowances, for example, 15,000 yen for every person who had a child under the age of 3. It's, small sort of bait here and there, but nothing really deep and influential in terms of long-term economic turnaround for the Japanese domestic economy. Harutaka mentioned the success of the Economic Security Promotion Act, which again was by and large an external-facing policy that limited Japan's exposure to aggressive economic things like supply chain, being cut out of the supply chain by adversaries. And on this front, I think the general public does evaluate Kishida's economic policies positively, but again, largely external facing and not for the domestic economy. So segue into Ishiba's economic policies, what do we think is coming down the line? Right up to the point of the Liberal Democratic Party's presidential elections, Ishiba tended, I think, to give a lot of policy talk, probably more for electoral gains by saying things like he would hold BOJ interest rates fairly low, very close to the 0% line, 0.25, which is really very much against what he's traditionally said. He was much more hawkish in terms of fiscal policies in the past. Even saying things like hiking the minimum wage up to 1,500 yen by within the next few years, something that would require a considerable change to minimum wage policy in Japan, something like 7% or so annually over the next 4 or 5 years, as well as advocating for supplementary budgets for economic growth from various ministries, all of which he's basically reversed in the first few days of his prime ministership. So I think there are a lot of question marks. What is he saying as he faces general elections coming up in the next few days? Ishiba in general is not known to be a policy wonk in terms of economic policy, aside from his support of rural areas, which his home base is in Tottori, one of the smallest and most sparsely populated prefectures in Japan. Aside from sort of support for these rural areas, he's really not known to have either strong economic policies, nor does he have close economic advisees that are well known as previous prime ministers have. So I also agree with the assessment that there's going to be a greater role for economic bureaucracies, including METI and MOF, and even probably MOFA, as Japan looks more externally for economic support and greater trade. And also, Ishiba pretty much known to be a strong proponent of the traditional LDP position, that is an affinity for tight fiscal and monetary policy. So we don't really predict that much change from there. I just want to spend the last few minutes I have on two issues that I think are broader issues for the Japanese economy that's really staring at Japan immediately. People tend to think of these as long-term issues, but actually there are also short and medium-term repercussions. First and foremost is the aging and shrinking of the population, which is, of course, expected for the next 100 years, but already here in 2024, we've already, turned around and are decreasing population with a rapidly aging population as well. This is not just, of course, unique to Japan, and I was actually quite surprised that the recent Nobel Economic Prize winner, Acemoglu, wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times, I think a couple of days ago, saying that Japan could be a model for the United States in terms of an aging society. And that was kind of shocking to me because Japan has clearly struggled to try to figure out how to deal with an aging workforce. It has succeeded in some ways, that is using automation, AI, robotics to support its manufacturing sector, even doing so well as to invite TSMC's factories to Kumamoto, which is one of more rural areas of Japan, more successfully than perhaps in Arizona here in the United States. But the future is very much a question mark, especially in terms of how Japan would educate a workforce that is going to be much smaller in size than it has been in the past and has to support a much larger, proportionately larger aging population. How is that going to be implemented? How is that going to be designed? Ishida certainly has not said anything about what those plans are for Japan going forward. And the recent overtake of Germany as the third largest economy in the world, and Japan now dropping down to fourth, has many people worried about Japan's economic future and how that's going to play out. And so it would really behoove Ishida to come up with a very strong plan, or at least relegate that to some very good advisors who could give him some, not just advice, but a sort of a comprehensive plan of where Japan could be going. And my final slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the women that Rieko was talking about earlier. So during Kishida's time, Japan's minimum wages had risen, went as far as I think 1,054 yen as of today. But the distribution is highly unequal. And in particular, full-time female workers, not part-time, not the people who work seasonally, but the full-time female workers in Japan still only earn about 72% of the equivalent male worker doing the equivalent job. And this wage differential has been abused in many ways by large corporations. People are celebrating the fact that larger corporations now hire more women, but that's also one reason for larger corporations to hire more women is that they can also pay them less. And so despite the fact that the bottom is rising, the average wage earning capabilities of Japanese workers has really not changed all that much throughout the last decade. And this is another area in which there's a little bit of fairy dust magic going on and a little bit of voodoo magic going on in terms of how voters and how Japanese citizens are being told that wages are going up. But in fact, the wages that are being paid out and distributed among the population is still highly both unequal and as a whole quite low. So these are areas that I hope that the new Ishiba cabinet will be able to address, and also the very areas that are needed to do things like turn around Japan's extremely low fertility rates. How can women who only earn such a small fraction of what men earn also be incentivized to have larger families? So I think my time is up. Hand it over to Phillip. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shimizu. That was interesting presentation. Okay, so now I would like to invite Dr. Phillip Lipscy.
Great. Well, thank you again to Eve and May and Miyoko for jointly hosting this event. It's always wonderful to put these on together. And thank you all in the audience as well. You probably can't tell, but there's many of you, and we've already have a few questions in the Q&A. So feel free to type those in while I speak. If you have any questions, we'll get to those after my presentation. So I'll just very briefly touch on foreign policy. I think some of this ground was already covered by some of the previous speakers, but just to set the context, in recent years, I think it's fair to say that Japan has emerged globally as an important leader and key defender of the rules-based order. And most experts of US-Japan relations would argue, I think, that the relationship is about as strong as it has ever been. And that's despite the fact that we have very serious geopolitical tensions, 4 years of a Trump presidency. The relationship really has remained quite robust. And in the meantime, as Harutaka pointed out, Japan has been building both multilateral and bilateral partnerships with a variety of countries, including Australia and, of course, Canada, where you see a really significant development in cooperation of the sort that we didn't see in the past. And much of this, of course, we can attribute to the Abe government, partly because it was a government that was in power for such a long time and had considerable scope to do many things. But I've done work on the Abe government with many of my co-speakers in this panel, but I think they do deserve some credit. For example, in terms of taking the lead on resuscitating the TPP as the CPTPP during the Trump presidency, when the global trade system seemed to be under threat. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy/vision, which really did influence and shape the subsequent US, Canadian, and many other countries' versions of their own Indo-Pacific strategies. And during the Abe government, you had a very dynamic foreign policy with quality infrastructure, the use of foreign aid in strategic ways, and so forth. And so it was a really sort of an interesting moment when we think about Japanese foreign policy making in the post-war period. Now, the Kishida government, represents quite a bit of continuity. Of course, Kishida was foreign minister for much of the Abe years. If you talk to Japanese officials, I think there's an impression that whereas Abe tended to centralize power and exert a lot of political leadership, the Kishida government brought many bureaucrats back into the driver's seat, and there was a bit more delegation of policy making. But in many ways, that led to greater continuity. And as others mentioned, Kishida also is associated with some new policy initiatives, particularly in the geoeconomic areas and supply chain de-risking. There's the GX, or Green Transformation Strategy, as well. This one, I think the first prime minister really to make a big policy shift was Suga, who came in between with the 2050 net zero target. But the Kishida government basically developed a policy to try to get there. I think this one, we could debate about whether it's truly ambitious enough to reach that long-term goal. But nonetheless, it was put in place. And of course, there's the major defense spending increase to about 2% of GDP. that comes along with a variety of new capabilities and new areas like cyber and space and so forth. So, both prime ministers, you could argue, have had transformative impacts on Japanese foreign policy making in their own ways, while representing considerable continuity with what came before them. And so this brings us to Ishiba. I think the public perception of Ishiba is that he's extremely knowledgeable about defense and security issues. You see words like security otaku thrown about, that, it's something that he really deeply cares about, and he's made a name for himself as being an expert on these issues. At the same time, many of his foreign policy and security perspectives are outside of the current Japanese mainstream. They're sort of very strongly held personal views. The obvious manifestation of this was the East Asian NATO idea, which kind of came out at a very untimely moment. But he essentially gave an interview to the Hudson Institute on the eve of the LDP presidency election, and it's not the right time to give this kind of off-the-cuff type of interview if you think you're going to be the leader of your party. So I don't know if he didn't really think that he had a chance, or it was just bad planning. But immediately as he became prime minister, this was what people were talking about. And as Harutaka pointed out, I don't necessarily think this is going to be his number one priority. But it did create an impression, as well as considerable pushback, right? So there were a lot of interviews of policymakers saying, no, this is not something that we're interested in. And many security experts in Japan, who you would think would be supportive of a prime minister like this, also basically said, no, this is not going to work. His ideas are old school and 10, 15 years behind the times and so forth. We invited Ishiba to Stanford one time when I was faculty there, and just to illustrate, he basically talked about, we should station Japanese troops in California in order to make the alliance more equal. So, this is somebody who has very strong opinions and is not really kind of diplomatic about them, right? He sort of, likes to say provocative things in many ways. Another point that he has, over the years felt strongly about is renegotiating the status of forces agreement with the United States, which, although I think is reasonable, could create potential frictions with the United States if he goes through with them. And so, although I do agree with Harutaka that many of these items probably won't make it onto the policy agenda, if he does win the election, it's also difficult to predict, whether he'll kind of go back to the LDP's traditional line or actually try to make a name for himself by kind of pushing some of this agenda. And so I think that remains interesting to watch. I agree with some of my earlier speakers, Kay in particular, on kind of, there seems to be less clarity on economic policy. If you look at the key ministerial appointments that Ishiba has made, they tend to lean towards defense policy experts rather than economic experts. And there isn't kind of an equivalent of Abenomics or even new capitalism for that matter, sort of a statement of what the economic policy is going to look like. And so that's a bit troublesome given the importance of economic relations, I would say, to Japanese foreign policy making today. And turning to the opposition, the CDP, the main opposition party, is currently led by former Prime Minister Noda. And he's known for having relatively moderate policy views. Among the DPJ prime ministers, I think the consensus is that he was, sort of the most reasonable one. If you talk to LDP conservatives, they give him some credit for being sort of the good DPJ prime minister among the three. And if you look at the CDP's foreign policy platform, it's quite striking that for the most part, it looks very similar to the status quo foreign policy priorities of the LDP. If you read the section on South Korea, it's really basically like, we will strictly request that Korea adhere to the final comfort women agreement. There's a lot of emphasis on abductees. And so if you hid the name, you might mistake it for the LDP's foreign proposals. There's some differences, like an emphasis on human rights. The CDP is opposed to NATO-style nuclear sharing arrangement very clearly. Perhaps the most controversial point would be they suggest that the Henoko relocation in Okinawa should be canceled, which would, again, create potential friction with the United States. But for the most part, I think on foreign policy, regardless of which party ultimately comes to power, the most likely outcome is continuity. And this has been the case with most Japanese elections in recent memory. But I think this one is a little bit more interesting because of Ishida's unorthodox views and uncertainty about how much he'll decide to push for them if he comes out victorious on the other side of this election, as well as, although not likely, I would say, kind of non-zero chance that we end up with some type of an opposition coalition government, in which case that could also create some interesting foreign policy frictions. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Lipscy. Now I would like to move on to the Q&A session, and we've been receiving many questions, so thank you so much for all the participants.
Yeah.
Dr. Lips, yeah.
Yeah, so the plan is for me to do a first quick round, rapid fire question, a bit of fireside. So I have one question for each, but you only have 1 to 2 minutes, and then we'll open up after that. And so I have my question to Kenneth. It would be good to know if you have any surveys on the policy issues that are the top 3 policy issues for voters right now in making their votes in terms of policy, right? And is foreign policy part of it in any way, given how much it has been a focus? And then the side question or implication, given the frustration that you described, there's great frustration toward the LDP, but it's bottled up. It has nowhere to go in some ways because there's fragmentation. What is the consequence of that? If the LDP wins by default, does it mean we will have a cabinet with very low support very quickly? When you have that many frustrated voters, what does it do, right? Or does it open the space for future, populist leader or party to emerge out of nowhere? Frustration goes somewhere, right? So what do you think?
So 2 points quickly. One is the surveys that I've seen suggest that the top 2 priorities are by far bread and butter economic issues, particularly prices, jobs, and wages, and economic growth more generally. The second is the resilience of varying forms of social insurance programs, pensions, healthcare on the one hand, but also importantly, childcare, which is something that Kishida tried to push, and I think Ishiba will try to push as well. I think foreign policy matters to some voters. I think they matter primarily to conservative voters in Japan, at least in surveys that I've done myself. So it's not clear to me or it's not obvious that will actually dictate foreign policy. But I think it does make a difference, as Phillip was alluding to earlier, that President Noda of the CDP looks like a centrist Japanese politician and not so far from the LDP on foreign policy issues. To voters who may be leaning more liberal or progressive on social matters, but are concerned and prefer a more traditional or conservative approach to foreign policy, the CDP may all of a sudden look more palatable. But I don't think that's a very large fraction of voters. The second, relating to where the frustration goes, I think the big hurdle for the Ishiba administration, even if they do stay in power, either on their own or really through their coalition with the Komeito, is an upper house election needs to take place next summer. And as we see in many countries, what are often described as second-order elections, so not the election that determines a prime, but determines a second branch of office, is a place where dissatisfaction often manifests. Even if you are unsure about the opposition leading the government, you may want the opposition pushing the brakes in other ways. And as Harutaka has written quite extensively, the upper house in Japan is fairly powerful, perhaps not as powerful as the American Senate, but still plays a big role in shaping public policy and the pace of agenda setting in the government. And so I think even if the current coalition retains its majority in the election on October 27th, I suspect that they will face a fairly major uphill battle in next summer's upper house election.
Great, fabulous. That was very, very insightful. So to Rieko-san, I was struck by the regression. When you think of the picture of the cabinet of Ishiba and you compare just to the Kaifu cabinet, where there were, I think, 5 women, if I remember right, and Hosokawa, and of course, all the, and others, and of course, Hatoyama and so on, even Koizumi, right? So we seem to go back to the 80s or something. And how could such regression happen and not be punished by voters who don't seem to prefer male? It doesn't match at least their preference that it's so male dominated. And so will punishment go somewhere? Or where did, Koizumi used to bring all those female politicians and there was this great excitement at the time. Where has it gone, right? Why is it gone now?
Right, that's a good question. I think the in terms of you talked just now with Kenneth about issue priorities, and I think the question of gender really is not very high on voters' issue priorities. So on the one hand, they are not tremendously pleased with the picture that they're seeing, but on the other hand, it doesn't frustrate them enough to make a difference at the polls. But when you do see female candidates running for office, they do quite well, especially if they're running from the LDP or even local election. Koike just won her 3rd term quite handily. So when there is a female candidate, a conservative candidate to be voted for, voters are quite happy to vote them in. But otherwise, I think it doesn't quite make it up to the threshold of importance for them to motivate them to make a difference.
Great. Now to Harukata-san. There is really a Kishida paradox. That is, Kishida was known to be dovish, from Hiroshima, and he's the one who ends up breaking the Katzenstein taboo. Where we used to discuss even long ago in classes that it would be very, very hard to 1%, the defense over GDP, sort of taboo. And it's Kishida, not Abe, who ends up breaking it. So why is he able to do this? Why did he feel the need to do it? Is it driven by external events, or is it just the sheer momentum of Abe, which finally comes to fruition under Kishida? So I'm curious about this. And then finally, maybe your thought on the financial risk that Japan faces. We had a bit of a scare with the bond market in the summer when the interest rate was hiked a little bit. How dangerous is the bond market, and where are we financially?
Thank you very much for 2 good questions. To answer your first question about this expanding on the expansion of the Japanese defense budget. I mean, the discussion within the government really started during the tenure of Prime Minister Abe. And they carefully examined what kind of in what areas we need more budget to finance our to deal with defense needs, and it really reflects the structural change in East Asian security environment with the rise of China. Okay, and Kishida. I think the dovishness of Kishida helped to announce that change, because people were not that did not have to be worried so much if a dovish guy implements that kind of policies. And much of Japanese public supported the policy. I think it is really reflected the outbreak of Ukraine war. The Japanese public came to realize that real war could really take place even in this kind of period. Okay, and now just to give you an example, I often go to this haircut to get a haircut near my university. And this guy shows no interest in politics. He knows I'm a political scientist, but he doesn't care. But when Ukraine war took place, oh, Takenaka sensei, something really shocking took place in the world, and I'm very much concerned. That was his take, right? So that really how I think the war astonished the Japanese ordinary people. Okay, on the second question about how to finance this expansion of budget, it's a really serious concern. And I think, but I don't think there's much option for Japan. We are probably the Japanese government expects the BOJ to keep interest low. And what we are really implementing is inflation tax. We have inflation now about 2% or 2.5%, which really enhances revenues, consumption tax or the corporate tax or the income tax. And I think that's we try to manage the deficit by imposing this virtual hike in the tax by inflation. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, very, very helpful. Thank you. So to Kei, I wonder if you can say anything more on what happened to Kishida's new form of capitalism. You know, there was so much written about it. It was this great excitement, and there was a return to embedded liberalism and so on. I mean, even in theoretical or policy term, what really killed it? Did he get distracted by the security crisis, or was there no leg there? Or and then on the female work situation, just a quick thing, has female employment rate gone up actually in the last 5 or 10 years? Have women been entering the workforce more?
So on the new capitalism, I hate to say it, but in hindsight, I would think that that was more sort of political rhetoric. Like he needed to have something in as like after Abenomics, what was his thing, you know? And his thing was new capitalism. And of course, like this is something that was clearly going to be supported by the general public. Redistribution was so necessary, especially for the bottom, 50% of Japanese society that largely has been left out of any amount of economic development growth that there had been in the last so-called 3 lost decades. But I do think that you're right in the sense that one, he did sort of lose interest in it. So many other distractions, especially on the external security front, not to mention the war in Ukraine, but also just a lack of funds. Like where was this money going to come from? Who was going to pay for it? He didn't have sort of the excess funds to do that. And he didn't even go through with things like, the capital, the reduction or increase in the capital gains tax that would have at least put on the facade of greater fairness, right? Taxing those that have at the very top brackets of Japan's income spread a little more, even though that amount of money would not have added so much to Japan's treasury, that at least it would have made a facade of fairness, and that didn't even come through. So I don't think he was anywhere close to coming to actually implementing the new capitalism whatsoever. On the female employment, full-time employment for women has increased. And again, I'm very cynical about this in the sense that it's a tactic by larger corporations that they can replace full-time men with full-time women if they can only to pay 70% of a man's wages. And so not at the very top echelons, certainly not in the C-suites nearly as much as we would like to see. But in the second level tier, sort of managerial levels, women have increased in number, but still by and large, receiving only a fraction of the pay that men do. And even though there's been an absolute increase, the percentages are still abysmally low. And so far as, those hiring practices remain, it'll be very difficult for gender balances to play out in Japanese corporates.
Terrific. Okay. And then finally for Phillip, so I think we have to put on the table Japan-China relations and Taiwan. So I was wondering, since Ishiba is on the record, on one hand being hawkish, as Harutaka said, strong defense, strong, NATO, etc. On the other hand, he has also made statements about the need for communication, diplomatic engagement, and he just had a very polite meeting on the margin of the ASEAN summit with just the Prime Minister, but he will soon see Xi Jinping at the G20. So with this dual approach that we seem to see, is it real, is it not real? Is he basically implementing Thomas Schelling's approach to deterrence, where you need strong capabilities, strong will, and reassurance, diplomatic reassurance? Is it this kind of very clever practitioner of deterrence? Is it what you see? And does he have a plan to deal with the arms race that's developing in the region? Because arms race leave everybody worse off, right? That's a prisoner dilemma. How do you see his role in mitigating an arms race and a security spiral?
Right.
Question is Japan-Canada. We need to say something in Japan-Canada as fellow. I noticed that of all the partnerships listed by Harutaka, it did not include Japan-Canada, whereas Canada in the Indo-Pacific strategy has included Japan as a top priority. So what do you see there?
Yeah, great. So I think on Japan, China, Taiwan, the story generally has been one of continuity. Of course, there was a very rough patch during the DPJ government and the beginning of the Abe government. But, for much of the Abe government, I think, the policy was largely as you described, basically building up Japanese capabilities, but also pursuing somewhat better relations with China. And it's difficult to see Ishiba really deviating from that in a meaningful way. I think if you had a Takaichi prime ministership, perhaps there might have been some differences triggered by historical issues and so forth. But here, I think, largely you'll see a continuity in what we've seen over the past decade or so. Japan, Canada, we actually had the ambassador here in University of Toronto last week, and it was striking to me, kind of the optimism expressed. This is Ambassador Yamanouchi, the ambassador of Japan to Canada. The kind of wide-ranging initiatives across security, economic issues, environmental cooperation, that's going on in that bilateral relationship. And he noted that, really Australia and Canada are in some ways the most promising partners. And I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear that Australia is promising, but Canada being right up there is somewhat new. And so I think from the Japanese side, there's a lot of interest in building up that bilateral relationship. And I think that's reciprocated on the Canadian side as well. So this is one I think that's well worth watching, regardless of whether you're located in Canada or not.
So Harukata-san will include that in the list.
Yes, please, next time.
Canada. Okay, let's open up to the general Q&A. And I know there's 10 questions by now, 12, yeah.
Yeah, so my crew has been trying to organize, so pack up the questions. So I would like to ask everyone here. So first question is that economically wise, the growing inflation of prices and the stagnation of average salary seems to be one of the key issues facing Japanese citizens, so especially for the younger generation as well. So would we see something new from the Ishiba government on this? Anyone wants to answer? Maybe Dr. Takenaka?
Yeah, I think Ishiba made a commitment to raise the minimum wage to 1,500, which is still much lower than European or American standard. By the end of this 2020s. the prior goal was, the Kishida's target was by mid-2030s. So I think he front-loaded the deadline. So I think that will get this problem a little bit, but but it really depends on companies to raise their wages. So we will see. We have to see. And probably many people continue to remain dissatisfied. And that is a kind of a fuel for LDP leaning toward to the right. So I think that's an urgent issue for the LDP to address this issue.
I agree on the 1,500 yen minimum wage, except that implies that there will be more than 7% annual raise in the minimum wage, which is politically impossible. So I feel like, yes, he promised, but that's an empty promise because it's just not going to be possible by 2030. Just to put that out there.
If I can jump in, one issue that came up was bond yields and changes in interest rates. And one issue that is perennially in discussion is what to do with Japan's consumption tax rate. The left has pushed for a decrease, but in a practical sense, I think certainly medium to long term, the consumption tax needs to go up to pay for higher debt repayment costs. And that effectively is going to raise prices. So how these are going to counterbalance, rising minimum wages on the one hand, which is very difficult, and raising taxes, which is probably even more difficult, but the government is going to have to pick its poison one way or the other.
Right. Thank you so much. I hope it answered the questions. Okay. The next question that I want to ask is that how does the current or future Japanese government view the implications of the US elections happening in November? Maybe some more foreign policy question? Yeah.
I think, in many ways, Japan looks at this in the same way as Canadians look at it, which is, first of all, what happened to America? But, number two is, okay, we need some kind of a plan regardless of what happens. And I think, my view is that there's a little bit of complacency in Japan because during the first Trump administration, that relationship was surprisingly strong. And I would, credit that to fairly, distinct circumstances that won't necessarily be replicated. That Abe had a little bit of a personal relationship with Trump that maybe Ishiba will be able to cultivate, but it's not obvious that he'll be able to. And I think a second Trump administration, particularly with the new tariff policies that they're talking about, could create even more economic volatility that affects Japan. So I think it's a matter of significant anxiety. But relative to some other countries where the worries about a potential Trump administration are much more elevated, I think there's sort of a less panic in the air in Japan compared to some other countries.
I'm not sure about that because if Trump, I'm sorry for jumping in, but if if Mr. Trump gets elected, there will be a severe concern for U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan in case of Taiwan contingencies, and that will probably require Japanese authorities in the field of security policies to probably revise some of the policies, but I don't know what they will be at a loss, not at a loss, but that will be a huge challenge. For if Kamala Harris is elected, I think it's probably U.S. security policy towards East Asia will continuation of the Biden administration to be okay, but Trump's, he made something very uncertain or scary about possible Taiwan contingencies, and that the Chinese might misinterpret that his statement, might misinterpret his statement. So that's that we have to check that aspect when Mr. Trump is elected.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that interesting insight. I would like to pick another question it's about the gender thing. So is there any potential for Japan to implement a gender quota or reservation system for the number of the candidates or reserve district similar to the proposed system in India, for example? And would this be an effective step towards increasing women's representation in Japanese government or politics?
I guess I should address that. And
Yes.
the question of quotas is there is sort of a chicken or the egg problem. And I think what we know from existing studies is that usually countries need to have a certain percentage of women in the legislature in the first place before they start adopting quotas. And my sense is that Japan isn't quite there yet, with the lower house female representation percentage hovering at about 10%. It's really not high enough for them to start thinking about quotas. The opposition has been making noises for quite a few years now about introducing a bill to require quotas, but the LDP is not going to come on board. So I mean, I wouldn't rule it out, for the long term, but not in the next few years, I think.
If I can add to that, one impediment to quotas and is certainly the LDP. It's not necessarily because they're a conservative per se. It's that they've been winning so many elections repeatedly that any adoption of quotas will mean that they will have to convince many of their incumbents to step down and replace them with new candidates. And that is always very politically fraught and unlikely to happen. And so the best opportunity for a gender quota to be established is when there is a massive turnover in government, when new seats open up all of a sudden. And we'll see what happens with this upcoming election, but I don't think the turnover is going to be sufficiently high to create a new cohort of new candidates, and many of them who may be women, particularly because the opposition is nominating more of them.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I think I will ask another question. So Dr. Takenaka stated that this upcoming House of Representatives election will be the toughest for the LDP since the enactment of the electoral reform 30 years ago. So this suggests that the LDP is facing tougher environment now than it did prior to the August 2009 House of Representative election, which is lost by a landslide. So are other panelists agree with Dr. Takenaka's statement about this?
Is that what you said, Harutaka?
No, I think in terms, I mean, this will be I wouldn't say it's toughest, but I think that this is really the first time that LDP experiences general election when it is damaged by a political funding scandal. I mean, for the first time after the political reform of 1994, which puts in the LDP in a very difficult situation. Yeah.
But I don't think you were saying they're going to lose more badly than 2009.
No, I don't
right?
think I didn't say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Situation is very difficult for the LDP. The reason why I say, well, I have not made this. I have not referred to the possibility of the LDP losing the election, because, as Kenneth has said, the opposition is divided. In 2009, opposition succeeded in making a united front on the DPJ banner.
Yeah, I think 2009, which came on the heels of the global financial crisis, was globally a very tough time for any incumbent government that was facing elections. I think what's striking in this case is a lot of the issues facing the LDP are their own goals. It's scandals related to the kickbacks, but also remaining concerns about its ties to the Unification Church. And I think these are things that are hard to resolve immediately. But I think one thing that may be of concern is the LDP has tried to finesse how it deals with the nominations of candidates who were implicated in the kickback scandal. They denominated some, but not all. And had they denominated many of them, that might have posed more challenges, particularly because without the organizational backing of the party and just general coordination of campaign resources, they could have faced a tough challenge. But even in the districts where the kickback tinged candidates are running, the opposition didn't necessarily do that much better in coordinating their candidates. So on a district by district basis, I think the LDP may still survive by default, not necessarily because they're popular, but because nobody else is more popular than they are.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. The last question I wanted to pull up was, so what is the gist of immigration policy approaches of both Ishiba and Kishida tourism-related policies, and what it means for Japan's economy given the current global conflicts and situation? So it's certainly about the foreign policy, but anyone wants to?
I can start. In 2018, and also before that, there was a major liberalization of restrictions towards the entry of unskilled workers. And so there's been, in the last really 10, 15 years, great liberalization of what used to be quite stringent policies vis-a-vis people coming in from into Japan from around the world. A lot of those restrictions have now been lifted, but I think what has happened is that in contrast to perhaps what some of the businesses had been seeing, the entry of new immigrants has not quite been, I mean, there are more foreign workers today than previously, but it has not been this rapid surge of influx of foreign workers that perhaps the businesses had hoped to see. It really, despite the liberalization, the immigration really is nowhere near levels that are sort of needed to fill the labor shortages that are ongoing in Japan at the moment. I mean, it remains to be seen whether Ishiba will continue the path of liberalization, but my sense is that there's not all that much to be liberalized, especially after the 2018 reforms, although I'd be curious to see what the other panelists think.
I think the caps on the number of new visas issued is still reasonably low. Now, it depends on how we think of reasonable and what low looks like. But I think one fundamental change over the last decade, this speaks a little bit to what Kay was saying about population dynamics, is when it looked like Japan was one of the few countries that was obviously facing a population decline, and Japan was a relatively attractive place, particularly for those from Southeast Asia or South Asia to come to, Japan could try to calibrate very carefully how it attracted foreign labor. But the difference now is Japan is competing with Taiwan, with Korea, with Hong Kong, probably with mainland China, and not even talking about Europe, where many countries have very low fertility rates. And in that world, two things matter. One is what kind of wages and treatment can the Japanese government guarantee to people coming in. And I think the second, and this is definitely something that Kay is familiar with, is regional allocation of workers. Tokyo is dynamic. It is a major city. That's where many people want to go. But depopulation in varying ways is accelerating in rural areas. Not necessarily because they have fewer children, but because many of their young people leave to go to the big cities. And this is a big shock on farming industry, for example. And I think that's an area of how to allocate even the small number of workers coming into Japan to different regions of Japan, where Ishiba may be able to take greater leadership, although I don't think he's made very pronounced statements on that point.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you very much for answering those questions. And thank you so much for everyone who has sent us thoughtful questions. So the event is running over time and it's coming to its end. And now I would like to invite Dr. Teber again and Dr. Lipscy for closing words.
Well, we'll be very short, obviously. It sounds like, fascinating, but in all dimensions that we have covered, politics, economic policy, foreign policy, we see a lot of continuity and status quo. And it's interesting that, that the LDP felt the need to send off Kishida and to bring Ishiba, because we don't see yet massive differences, right? There's a lot of structural forces around the policy from what we see. On the election itself, because of the fragmentation of opposition, I guess what came out of the discussion is the likeliness of a slightly lower maybe score for the LDP and Komeito, but they may still be on top. Although there is still a small probability of a surprise. I know newspapers are talking about that, of the loss of majority, for example. So it was pretty fascinating. We covered all those dimensions, and it shows something exciting happening. And maybe I'll turn to Phillip now for.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It was a great discussion. I learned a lot myself, and it was really great to see so many audience members turn out for the event. Really shows how much interest there is in Japanese politics and foreign policy right now. So, let's plan on doing a follow-up event perhaps after the election to see where things stand. But thank you, Eve and Milko and May, for your help with organizing this event, all the panelists, and the audience members for a really great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Milko.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.